The year was 1923, and desperation had a way of stripping dignity from the strongest souls. But when Joseph Running Bear saw the pale woman and her 3 young sons huddled against his fence, sharing potato peels and moldy bread crusts like it was their last meal on earth, he knew that what happened next would either damn them all or save them all. There was no middle ground when the world had already given up on you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The New Mexico wind carried more than dust that October evening. It carried the broken dreams of families who'd lost everything to the economic collapse that had hit farming communities like a plague, leaving behind ghost towns and hollow-eyed survivors who wandered the high desert looking for work that no longer existed. The reservation land where Joseph had built his small ranch sat at the crossroads of 2 worlds, the Apache traditions of his mother's people and the white man's world that had claimed his father's blood. And he'd learned to navigate both with the careful precision of someone who belonged fully to neither. Joseph had been checking his fence line when he first spotted them. The wooden posts and barbed wire marked the boundary between his modest spread and the county road that led to the dying town of Copper Ridge, a community that had thrived during the mining boom, but now existed mainly as a way station for desperate people heading somewhere else. Most travelers passed by without stopping, but something about this particular group had made him pause and really look. At first glance, they might have been mistaken for a family having a roadside picnic. The woman sat with her back against one of his fence posts, her 3 boys arranged around her in a protective semicircle. They were sharing food from a cloth bundle with the careful ceremony of people who understood the value of every morsel. But as Joseph watched from behind the cover of a nearby cottonwood tree, the true nature of their meal became heartbreakingly clear. The woman was maybe 30 years old, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes that suggested someone who'd aged beyond her years. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her dress, once probably a cheerful blue calico, had been mended so many times that it was more patch than original fabric. She moved with the economic grace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy, every gesture deliberate and necessary. Her oldest son looked to be about 14, with the gangly proportions of a boy on the verge of becoming a man. His clothes hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss, and he carried himself with the premature responsibility that came from being the man of the family too soon. The middle boy appeared to be around 11, still small enough to curl against his mother's side, but old enough to understand that their circumstances were dire. The youngest couldn't have been more than 7, and he alone seemed unaware of the gravity of their situation, chattering quietly to a small wooden horse he clutched in his dirty hands. What they were eating told Joseph everything he needed to know about their desperation. Potato peels that most people would have thrown to livestock, bread that had gone green with mold, carefully scraped clean before consumption. Apple cores that had been whittled down to nothing but seeds and stems. These weren't the remnants of a proper meal. They were the scraps that people threw away, somehow transformed into sustenance for a family with no other options. Joseph Running Bear was 36 years old, and he'd seen enough hardship in his life to recognize it in others. His Apache mother, Maria Singing Wind, had died when he was 12, victim of a tuberculosis outbreak that had swept through the reservation like wildfire. His Irish father, Patrick O'Malley, had been a cavalry officer who'd stayed after his service ended, drawn by the stark beauty of the high desert, and the remarkable woman who'd somehow seen past his uniform to the man underneath. Their marriage had been a scandal in both communities. The Apache viewed Patrick with suspicion as a representative of the people who'd driven them from their ancestral lands, while the white settlers saw Maria as a savage who'd corrupted a good Christian soldier. But somehow Patrick and Maria had found love in the space between worlds, creating a home where two traditions could coexist and flourish. Joseph had inherited the best of both worlds and the complications that came with them. From his mother's people, he'd learned to read the land like a book, to find water where others saw only desert, to move through the wilderness as silently as smoke. From his father, he'd inherited a stubborn Irish determination and the education that came from books brought west in a cavalry saddlebag. He spoke 3 languages fluently, English, Spanish, and Chiricahua Apache, and could navigate the bureaucratic maze of government land offices as easily as he could track deer through mountain forests. After his parents' deaths, Patrick had followed Maria within 2 years, as if he couldn't bear to live in a world without her. Joseph had inherited their small ranch and the complicated legacy of belonging to multiple worlds simultaneously. He raised cattle and horses on land that straddled reservation boundaries, serving as an unofficial mediator between Apache families and white bureaucrats who needed someone to translate more than just language. It was a lonely existence in many ways. Too Apache for most white communities, too assimilated for some traditional Apache families, Joseph had learned to find companionship in solitude and purpose in the work of helping others navigate the spaces between worlds. His ranch house, built by his father but decorated with his mother's traditional crafts, stood as a testament to the possibility that different cultures could coexist without one destroying the other. But as he watched the woman and her sons share their meager meal, Joseph felt a loneliness that went deeper than cultural isolation. These people represented something he'd been missing without realizing it. The simple human connection that came from sharing space with people who mattered, who depended on each other and found strength in that mutual dependence. The oldest boy was speaking quietly to his mother, their conversation too soft for Joseph to overhear, but animated enough to suggest some kind of disagreement. The woman kept shaking her head, her expression gentle but firm. Finally, the boy stood up, with the frustrated energy of someone who'd lost an argument, and walked to the fence line, his hands gripping the barbed wire as he stared across Joseph's pastures toward the distant mountains. That's when Joseph got his first clear look at the boy's face and felt his heart constrict with recognition. Not recognition of the individual, but recognition of the expression, the particular combination of desperation and determination that came from being young, and responsible for people you loved but powerless to actually help them. Joseph had worn that same expression at 14, when his mother's illness had stretched through a winter that seemed determined to kill everything it touched. The boy was thin in a way that spoke of systematic hunger rather than natural build. His dark hair hung in his eyes, but Joseph could see the sharp intelligence there, the way he catalogued every detail of the landscape, as if looking for opportunities that others might miss. His clothes were clean but worn, patched with careful stitches that suggested a mother who took pride in her family's appearance despite their circumstances. As Joseph watched, the boy's gaze found the small herd of cattle grazing in the far pasture, and his expression shifted to something approaching hope. He called softly to his mother, pointing toward the animals, and Joseph realized what was happening. The boy was calculating distances, trying to figure out if they could reach the cattle without being seen, wondering if there might be a way to obtain milk or meat without technically stealing. The woman followed her son's gaze and immediately shook her head with more force than before. Even from a distance, Joseph could see her explaining something to the boy, probably reminding him that taking what didn't belong to them would make them thieves, no matter how desperate their circumstances. The boy's shoulders slumped in defeat, but he nodded acceptance of his mother's moral authority. It was this moment, watching a hungry teenager accept his mother's refusal to compromise her principles, even in the face of starvation, that made Joseph's decision for him. He'd been raised by people who understood that dignity was sometimes the last thing a person possessed, and that preserving it was often more important than preserving life itself. But he'd also been raised to understand that sometimes Providence put you in a position to help preserve both. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Joseph stepped out from behind the cottonwood tree, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible so as not to startle them. The oldest boy spotted him first, immediately stepping in front of his mother and younger brothers with protective instincts that would have made a warrior proud. The woman rose gracefully, her hand resting on her middle son's shoulder as she prepared to gather her family and move on. "Good evening," Joseph called when he was still 20 feet away, pitching his voice to carry without seeming threatening. "Beautiful sunset tonight." The woman nodded politely but didn't speak, her green eyes taking in Joseph's appearance with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats quickly. Joseph knew what she was seeing, a tall man with the copper skin and high cheekbones of his Apache heritage, but dressed in the practical clothes of a working rancher. His long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and his face carried the kind of weathered dignity that came from years of outdoor work. "We weren't trespassing," the oldest boy said quickly, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent uncertainty. "We were just resting by the road." "I can see that," Joseph replied gently. "Roads free to everyone, far as I know. You folks traveling far?" The woman finally spoke, her voice carrying a slight accent that Joseph couldn't immediately place. "Just passing through," she said. "We'll be moving on soon." Joseph nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable, though he could see that they had. No wagon, no horses, no possessions beyond what they could carry. Moving on meant walking, probably toward the next town that might have work or charity to offer. It also meant sleeping outdoors as the high desert temperatures dropped toward freezing, with 3 young boys who were already weakened by hunger. "Names. Joseph Running Bear," he said, taking another step closer. "This is my land here." He saw the woman's face tighten with worry, probably calculating how quickly they could gather their few possessions and escape if he decided to run them off. The middle boy had moved closer to his youngest brother, ready to grab the child and run if necessary. "I'm sorry if we've caused any trouble," the woman said carefully. "We'll move along right away." "No trouble at all," Joseph assured her. "I was just wondering if you might be interested in sharing a proper meal before you continue your journey. Gets cold out here at night, and it's a long way to the next town." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge that might bear their weight or might collapse under the burden of their need. Joseph could see the war playing out behind the woman's eyes, pride battling with practical necessity, independence fighting against the simple need to feed her children. The youngest boy tugged at his mother's skirt. "Mama, I'm still hungry," he said in the guileless way of children who hadn't yet learned that admitting need could be dangerous. Joseph saw the moment when the woman's resolve cracked. Not for herself, but for her children. It was the same expression his own mother had worn when accepting help from neighbors during the worst of her illness, the look of someone who would endure any humiliation to protect the people she loved. "That's very kind of you," she said quietly, "but we don't have any way to pay for a meal." "Who said anything about payment?" Joseph asked, genuinely confused. "I was talking about sharing supper. My mother always said food tastes better when there's good company to share it with." The oldest boy stepped forward slightly, his protective instincts warring with teenage suspicion. "Why would you want to help complete strangers?" It was a fair question, and one that Joseph had been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to reveal his presence. Why was he doing this? Part of it was simple human compassion. He had food, and they needed it. Part of it was the influence of his upbringing, both Apache traditions of hospitality and Irish Catholic teachings about caring for those in need. But there was something else, something deeper, that Joseph was only beginning to understand. Looking At this family, battered by circumstances but still intact, still caring for each other, he felt a longing he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The longing for connection, for purpose beyond simple survival, for the particular kind of meaning that came from being needed by people who mattered. Because kindness is like water in the desert, Joseph said finally, the words coming from some deep well of inherited wisdom. It's meant to be shared, not hoarded, and because my mother would box my ears if she knew I'd let a family go hungry when I had plenty to share. The woman studied his face for a long moment, and Joseph had the unsettling feeling that she was reading something in his expression that he hadn't meant to reveal. Finally, she nodded with the grave dignity of someone accepting a gift she couldn't reciprocate. "I'm Margaret Flanagan," she said. "These are my sons, Michael, Patrick, and Sean." She gestured to each boy in turn, and Joseph noted the Irish names that matched her slight accent. "Mrs. Flanagan," Joseph said with a slight bow that incorporated both his Apache and Irish heritage, "would you and your sons do me the honor of joining me for supper?" As they walked toward his house, Joseph found himself acutely aware of the picture they must present. A half-Apache rancher leading a family of Irish immigrants across land that belonged fully to neither culture. But for the first time in months, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The house that came into view was modest but well-maintained. A single-story adobe structure with a wide front porch, and windows that glowed with warm yellow light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the scent of cooking food drifted across the evening air. To the Flanagan family, who hadn't seen the inside of a real home in weeks, it must have looked like paradise. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly, and Joseph felt a flush of pride that surprised him with its intensity. As they climbed the front steps, Joseph paused with his hand on the door. Something told him that once he opened this door, once he invited these people into his home and his life, nothing would ever be quite the same. The thought should have been frightening, but instead it filled him with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. "Welcome," he said simply, opening the door wide and stepping aside to let them enter first. The word hung in the air like a promise, like the beginning of something none of them could have imagined when the evening started. And as Margaret Flanagan crossed the threshold with her 3 sons behind her, Joseph Running Bear felt the first stirring of something that might, eventually, become hope. Behind them, the New Mexico sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, as if the land itself was blessing this moment when 2 wounded families began the slow process of becoming something larger than either could have managed alone. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the gathering darkness a coyote called to its pack, a sound that might have been lonely or might have been a song of belonging, depending on who was listening and what they needed to hear. Joseph closed the door behind them and felt, for the first time in years, like he was truly home. The interior of Joseph's house revealed a world that none of the Flanagans had expected to find behind the adobe walls. The main room was a fascinating blend of 2 cultures that somehow harmonized rather than clashed. Apache blankets in geometric patterns of red, black, and white hung alongside Irish lace curtains that had clearly been made by skilled hands. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with both Celtic crosses carved from dark wood and small pottery vessels painted with traditional Apache designs. Margaret's eyes moved across the room with the careful appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. The furniture was simple but beautifully made, a large wooden table that could seat 8, chairs with woven rush seats, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace that showed the wear patterns of regular use. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Margaret caught glimpses of titles in 3 languages, including some that appeared to be handwritten journals. What struck her most, however, was how clean everything was. Not just tidy, but genuinely clean in a way that spoke of someone who took pride in his surroundings, despite living alone. The floors were swept, the windows were clear, and there wasn't a speck of dust on any surface. It was the home of a man who maintained standards even when no one was watching, and Margaret found herself relaxing slightly as she recognized the signs of someone who shared her own values about how life should be lived. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable," Joseph said, gesturing toward the large table. "I'll get supper started." Sean, the youngest boy, had been unusually quiet since entering the house, his 7-year-old mind struggling to process the sudden change from desperate hunger to warm hospitality. Now he tugged at his mother's dress and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mama, is this man a real Indian?" Margaret's face flushed crimson with embarrassment. "Sean Michael Flanagan, you mind your manners this instant." But Joseph just laughed, a rich sound that seemed to fill the room and chase away some of the tension that had been building since they'd crossed the threshold. "It's all right, Mrs. Flanagan. Children ask honest questions, and they deserve honest answers." He crouched down to Sean's level, bringing himself eye to eye with the curious boy. "I'm half Apache, half Irish," Joseph explained patiently. "My mother's people were the Chiricahua Apache, and my father came here from County Cork in Ireland. So I guess that makes me a little bit like you, Irish blood running through my veins." Sean's eyes widened with excitement. "My papa was from Ireland too. He used to tell us stories about leprechauns and fairy rings and the green hills where he grew up." The mention of Sean's father in past tense created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Joseph noticed how Michael, the oldest boy, immediately stiffened, and how Margaret's hand moved protectively to Patrick's shoulder. There was a story there, Joseph realized, and probably not one with a happy ending. "What happened to your father?" Joseph asked gently, directing the question to Margaret rather than pressing the child for details. Margaret's composure wavered for just a moment, and Joseph saw the grief that she kept carefully controlled for the sake of her children. "Tuberculosis," she said simply. "Last winter, we lost our farm in County Mayo after that. Couldn't keep up with the payments without Dennis's income." The bare facts told only part of the story, but Joseph could fill in the gaps. Ireland in 1923 was still reeling from years of political upheaval and economic hardship. For tenant farmers like Dennis Flanagan had probably been losing the primary breadwinner meant not just poverty, but complete destitution. Margaret and her sons had likely been evicted from the only home the boys had ever known, left with no choice but to join the thousands of Irish immigrants seeking better opportunities in America. "So you came to America for a fresh start," Joseph said, beginning to understand the magnitude of their journey. "Dennis always talked about America," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her late husband's dreams. "He said it was a place where a man could own his own land, where hard work was rewarded instead of taxed into poverty. We were saving money for passage when he got sick." Michael spoke up for the first time since entering the house, his 14-year-old voice carrying more bitterness than any child should possess. "Took everything we had just to bury him proper. Mama sold her wedding ring and her mother's silver to buy our passage to Boston." The anger in the boy's voice was directed not at Joseph, but at circumstances that had stolen his childhood and forced him to become the man of the family before he was ready. Joseph recognized the emotion, because he'd felt it himself after his parents died. The rage at a world that took good people too soon and left the survivors to struggle alone. "How long have you been in America?" Joseph asked. 4 months, Margaret answered. "We worked in the textile mills in Boston for a while, but the conditions—" She trailed off, but Joseph could imagine what she wasn't saying. The mills were notorious for their dangerous working conditions and poverty wages, places where desperate immigrants were exploited by employers who knew they had no other options. Patrick, the middle boy, had been quietly exploring the room while the adults talked. Now he stopped in front of a beautiful Apache basket that sat on a side table, its intricate patterns seeming to fascinate him. "Did your mama make this?" he asked Joseph. "She did," Joseph replied, moving to stand beside the boy. "That's a water basket. She wove it from willow and pine needles when I was about your age. See these patterns? Each one tells part of a story." Patrick traced the geometric designs with his finger, careful not to actually touch the basket. "What story does it tell?" Joseph studied the patterns, remembering the long winter evenings when his mother had worked on the basket while telling him about Apache traditions and the meaning behind various symbols. "This pattern here represents the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. And this zigzag design, that's the path of life, how it twists and turns in ways you can't predict." "Like how we ended up here?" Patrick asked with the insight that sometimes came from children who'd been forced to mature quickly. "Exactly like that," Joseph agreed, surprised by the boy's understanding. While they talked, Joseph had been moving efficiently around the kitchen, pulling ingredients from shelves in the cold box, starting a fire in the stove, and beginning preparations for what was clearly going to be a substantial meal. Margaret watched his movements with professional interest, noting his competence and organization. "Can I help?" she asked, standing up from the table. "I'm a good cook, and it doesn't seem right to let you do all the work when you're being so generous." Joseph paused in his slicing of potatoes and considered her offer. He could see that she needed to contribute something, that accepting charity without being able to give something back was difficult for her pride. At the same time, he recognized that this was his chance to learn more about who these people really were. "I'd be grateful for the help," he said finally. "I was planning to make a stew, but I'll be honest. I'm much better with cattle than I am with cooking. My efforts tend to be more functional than flavorful." Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd met, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face and revealed the beauty that hardship had temporarily obscured. "Well then, you're in luck. Dennis used to say I could make a feast out of turnip scraps and hope." As they worked together in the kitchen, a comfortable rhythm developed. Joseph provided the ingredients and basic preparations, while Margaret took charge of seasoning and technique, her experienced hands transforming simple components into something that smelled like a proper feast. The boys gradually relaxed, exploring the house with increasing confidence as they realized they were truly welcome. Michael discovered Joseph's small library and was soon absorbed in a book about cattle ranching, his quick mind clearly cataloging information that might prove useful. Patrick found a box of wooden toys that Joseph's father had carved for him as a child, and he shared them generously with Sean, who was delighted to find toys that were more sophisticated than his simple wooden horse. "You have a beautiful home," Margaret said as she stirred the stew, adding herbs from small jars that Joseph had pointed out. "It must have been wonderful growing up here with both your parents." Joseph nodded, though his expression grew thoughtful. "It was, though it wasn't always easy being caught between 2 worlds. The Apache children sometimes thought I was too much like my father, and the white children definitely thought I was too much like my mother. And now I try to take the best from both cultures and let the rest go," Joseph said. "My mother taught me to read the land and understand the cycles of nature. My father taught me to read books and understand the ways of commerce and government. Both sets of knowledge have served me well." Margaret glanced around the kitchen, noting the blend of practical efficiency and aesthetic beauty that characterized everything in the house. "They raised you well. This place feels like a real home, not just a house." The comment touched something deep in Joseph's chest. "It's been lonely since they passed," he admitted. "A house this size needs a family to fill it properly." There was something in his tone that made Margaret look at him more carefully, But before she could respond, Sean came running into the kitchen with an expression of pure excitement. "Mr. Joseph, Mr. Joseph, Patrick found a picture of your mama and papa. Can you tell us about them?" Joseph followed the boys into the main room, where Patrick was carefully holding a framed photograph that he'd discovered on one of the bookshelves. The picture showed a young Apache woman in traditional dress standing beside a tall man in cavalry uniform, both of them looking directly into the camera with expressions of quiet dignity. "That was taken just after they were married," Joseph said, taking the photograph and studying it with the careful attention of someone who treasured few physical reminders of his past. "My father was stationed at Fort Apache, and my mother was working as a translator for the Indian agency. People said they were crazy to think a marriage between them could work." "But it did work?" Michael asked, looking up from his book. "For 18 years, Joseph confirmed. They loved each other enough to build bridges between their different worlds. It wasn't always easy, but they proved it was possible." Margaret joined them in the main room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What happened to them?" Joseph replaced the photograph on its shelf with careful reverence. "Tuberculosis took my mother when I was 12. My father lasted 2 more years, but I think he died of a broken heart as much as anything else. He never seemed to recover from losing her." The mention of tuberculosis created another moment of shared understanding. Margaret knew firsthand the devastation that disease could bring to a family, how it could steal not just life, but hope itself. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Losing the people who love you changes everything." "It does," Joseph agreed, "but it also teaches you to value the connections you have while you have them." As if summoned by the serious turn in conversation, a wonderful aroma began drifting from the kitchen, signaling that the stew was ready. Joseph had been planning to serve a simple meal of beans and cornbread, but Margaret's expertise had transformed his basic ingredients into something that smelled like a celebration. "Supper's ready," Margaret announced, and the family gathered around the large table that had been built to accommodate more people than had sat at it in years. Joseph said a brief blessing that incorporated both Apache gratitude for the gifts of the earth and Christian thanks for daily bread, a prayer that somehow managed to honor both traditions without diminishing either. Then they began to eat, and Joseph was amazed by the transformation that food could work on people who had been living on scraps. The boys, who had been quiet and careful since their arrival, gradually began to relax and show their true personalities. Sean chattered about everything that caught his attention, from the patterns in the Apache blankets to the way the firelight danced on the walls. Patrick asked thoughtful questions about ranching and the different animals Joseph raised. Michael, despite his teenage reserve, couldn't hide his interest in the books and tools that filled the house. Margaret ate with the careful appreciation of someone who understood the value of a good meal, but Joseph noticed that she still automatically gave the choicest pieces of meat to her sons, even when there was clearly enough for everyone. It was an ingrained habit from months of scarcity, and it told him more about the depth of their recent hardship than any amount of explanation could have. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Joseph said honestly, and he saw Margaret flush with pleasure at the compliment. "It's the least I could do," she replied. "You've been so kind to us." As the evening progressed, Joseph found himself studying this family with growing interest. Margaret was clearly intelligent and capable, someone who'd managed to keep her family together through circumstances that would have broken many people. Michael had the makings of a responsible young man, despite the anger he carried about their situation. Patrick was curious and adaptable, the kind of child who would thrive given proper opportunities, and Sean maintained an optimism that suggested remarkable resilience for someone so young. But what struck Joseph most was how they functioned as a unit. They looked out for each other with automatic care, shared without being asked, and supported each other in ways that spoke of deep bonds. Forged by shared struggle, they were what he'd been missing without realizing it, a family that made a house feel like a home. After supper, as Margaret helped clean the dishes and the boys explored more of the house, Joseph found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated. When he'd first spotted them by his fence, these people needed more than just one meal and a place to spend the night. They needed stability, safety, and the chance to rebuild their lives. And he was in a position to offer all of those things. The question was whether he had the courage to take the risk, and whether they would trust him enough to accept an offer that would change all of their lives forever. As the evening deepened, and the fire in the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, Joseph Running Bear looked at the family that had somehow filled his house with laughter and conversation, and began to plan a future that none of them could have imagined just a few hours earlier. The morning sun streaming through the windows of Joseph's house revealed a transformation that went far beyond the simple fact that 4 desperate people had found shelter for the night. Margaret woke in the small guest room to the sound of her youngest son's laughter, actual genuine laughter for the first time in months, drifting through the adobe walls along with the rich aroma of coffee and frying bacon. She dressed quickly, in her one clean dress, carefully braided her hair, and emerged to find a scene that seemed almost too good to be real. Joseph stood at the stove, expertly managing what appeared to be a feast, while Sean sat at the large wooden table, chattering animatedly about a dream he'd had involving horses that could fly and mountains made of green grass like his father used to describe from Ireland. Patrick and Michael were setting the table with the careful precision of boys who'd been taught proper manners, and for the first time since Dennis's death, Margaret's family looked like children instead of survivors. "Good morning, Mrs. Flanagan," Joseph said, turning from the stove with a smile that transformed his typically serious face. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Margaret admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. The rich, strong brew was a luxury she'd almost forgotten existed, and she savored both the taste and the simple pleasure of drinking coffee that someone else had prepared for her. "Mr. Joseph's been telling us about the horses," Sean announced, with the enthusiasm that only 7-year-old boys could muster before 8 in the morning. "He says I can meet them after breakfast." Margaret looked questioningly at Joseph, who seemed slightly embarrassed by Sean's excitement. "I mentioned that I raise horses as well as cattle," he explained. "Your youngest seems particularly interested in animals." "Sean's always loved horses," Michael said, speaking for the first time. That morning, back in Ireland, there was an old farmer named Murphy who let Sean help with his draft horses, said the boy had natural instincts. This was news to Margaret, who hadn't realized that her shy youngest son had formed such a connection with animals, who during their time in County Mayo. But then again, there were probably many things about her children's inner lives that she'd missed while focused on the daily struggle of keeping them fed and housed. As they sat down to breakfast, real eggs, thick slices of bacon, biscuits with butter and honey, and fresh milk that tasted like luxury itself, Margaret found herself studying Joseph with new appreciation. Everything about him suggested competence and stability, from the way he'd prepared the meal to the easy manner in which he interacted with her sons. He answered their questions with patience, shared stories that made them laugh, and somehow managed to make them feel like welcome guests rather than charity cases. "What are your plans for today?" Joseph asked as they finished eating, directing the question primarily to Margaret, but including the boys with his gaze. It was a simple question that revealed the complexity of their situation. Plans required a destination, and they had none beyond the vague hope of finding work somewhere in the American West. Plans required resources, and they had less than $10 remaining from the money Margaret had earned in the Boston mills. Plans required some sense of possibility, and after months of disappointment, that was perhaps the scarcest commodity of all. "We need to keep moving," Margaret said carefully, not wanting to seem ungrateful for his hospitality, but aware that they couldn't impose indefinitely. There might be work in the next town. Joseph nodded thoughtfully, but Margaret noticed that he didn't immediately offer directions or suggestions about where that next town might be. Instead, he seemed to be weighing something in his mind, considering options that he wasn't yet ready to share. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he asked. "Anything honest," Margaret replied. "I can cook, clean, sew, take in laundry. Michael's strong for his age and willing to learn any trade. We're not particular, as long as it's enough to keep us together." The emphasis on staying together wasn't lost on Joseph. He'd heard stories about families torn apart by economic desperation, children sent to orphanages or distant relatives when parents couldn't afford to feed them. The determination in Margaret's voice suggested that she'd rather starve than see her family separated. "What about you boys?" Joseph asked, turning his attention to Michael and Patrick. "What kinds of things interest you?" Michael straightened in his chair, recognizing that this was somehow an important question. "I like working with my hands," he said, "building things, fixing things. Back in Ireland, I used to help the village carpenter sometimes. And I've been reading about cattle ranching. It seems like work that matters." Patrick's answer was more hesitant. "I like learning about things, animals and plants and how things work. Mama says I ask too many questions sometimes." "There's no such thing as too many questions," Joseph said firmly. "Questions are how we learn, and learning is what separates us from the animals we tend." Sean, not to be left out, piped up with typical 7-year-old confidence. "I want to work with horses. Mr. Joseph said they're smart, and they remember people who are kind to them." Joseph laughed, a sound that seemed to come more easily this morning than it had the night before. "Well, it sounds like you're all interested in the kind of work that happens on a ranch." There was something in his tone that made Margaret look at him more sharply. She'd learned to read subtle cues during the months of traveling and job-seeking, and she sensed that Joseph was building towards something more significant than casual conversation. "Mr. Running Bear," she said formally, "you've been more than generous to us already. We don't want to impose on your kindness any further." "What if it wasn't charity?" Joseph asked quietly. "What if I had a proposition that might benefit all of us?" The word proposition hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of possibility and concern. Margaret's experience with men making propositions to desperate women had taught her to be cautious, but something in Joseph's manner suggested that whatever he was considering was more complex than simple exploitation. "What kind of proposition?" Michael asked, his 14-year-old suspicion warring with hope. Joseph stood up from the table and walked to the window that looked out over his ranch lands. In the morning light, the property seemed to stretch endlessly. Pastures dotted with cattle, corrals containing horses, fields that would soon need harvesting, and beyond it all, the vast expanse of New Mexico high desert that promised both freedom and challenge. "This ranch is bigger than one man can properly manage alone," Joseph began, his back still turned to them. "I've got 200 head of cattle, 30 horses, crops that need harvesting, and land that could support twice as many animals if it were properly developed. I've been thinking for months about hiring help, but finding the right people." He turned back to face them. "Finding people I can trust, people who understand the value of hard work and honest dealing. That's been the challenge." Margaret felt her heart begin to beat faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Joseph returned to the table and sat down, his expression serious but hopeful. "I'm suggesting that you and your sons stay here permanently, not as hired hands, but as partners in building something bigger than any of us could manage alone." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of possibility and the terror of dashed hopes. Margaret had learned not to trust offers that seemed too good to be true, but she'd also learned to recognize genuine opportunity when it presented itself. What would that mean exactly? She asked carefully. Joseph had clearly been thinking about this proposal throughout the night, because his answer came with the kind of detail that suggested serious consideration. It would mean that this becomes your home, permanently. Michael would learn ranching and business management, everything he'd need to eventually run his own operation. Patrick could continue his education while learning about animal husbandry and land management. Sean could work with the horses and learn skills that would serve him well anywhere in the West. And me, Margaret asked. You'd manage the household and the business side of the operation, Joseph said. Keep the books, handle correspondence with buyers and suppliers, manage the domestic operations that keep a ranch running smoothly. It's work that requires intelligence, organization, and trustworthiness, qualities I've already seen you possess. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous, and Margaret's experience had taught her to look for the hidden costs in apparent generosity. What would you get out of such an arrangement? Joseph's answer was honest in a way that surprised her. I'd get a family, he said simply, and the chance to build something lasting instead of just maintaining what my parents left me. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his teenage skepticism unable to completely hide his interest. You'd really teach me to run a ranch, not just do the grunt work? The grunt work is part of it, Joseph said with a smile. But yes, I'd teach you everything, how to read the land, how to manage livestock, how to deal with buyers and government agents, how to plan for bad years and make the most of good ones. By the time you're 20, you'd know enough to start your own operation if that's what you wanted. Patrick's question was more practical. Would there be time for schooling? Real schooling with books and proper lessons? There's a teacher in Copper Ridge who comes out to the outlying ranches twice a week, Joseph explained, and I've got books that could keep a curious mind busy for years. Plus, there's no better education than learning to solve real problems, with real consequences. Sean's contribution to the discussion was characteristically direct. Would I get to name some of the horses? The ones you help raise from colts, Joseph promised, and Sean's grin threatened to split his face in half. But Margaret was still processing the implications of Joseph's offer, trying to understand what he wasn't saying as much as what he was. This is a very generous proposal, she said slowly, but I have to ask, what happens if it doesn't work out? What happens if we prove to be more burden than help? Joseph considered her question seriously before answering. Then we'd figure out a solution that worked for everyone. I'm not interested in creating a situation where anyone feels trapped or obligated. This would only work if it was good for all of us. And what about the legal aspects? Margaret pressed, her practical Irish mind considering the details that could cause problems later. Property ownership, inheritance rights, official arrangements. We'd work all that out properly, Joseph assured her. I'd want everything documented and legal, so there'd be no confusion about anyone's rights or responsibilities. Margaret looked at her three sons, seeing the hope dawning in their faces despite their attempts to remain cautious. Michael was trying to hide his excitement about the prospect of learning a real trade. Patrick was clearly imagining the possibilities that books and education might offer. Sean was practically vibrating with enthusiasm about working with horses. But there was one question that Margaret hadn't asked, perhaps because she was afraid of the answer. Mr. Running Bear, she said carefully, forgive me for being direct, but are you perhaps looking for more than just business partners and household management? Joseph's face reddened slightly, but he met her gaze directly. Mrs. Flanagan, I won't lie and say I haven't thought about the possibility of companionship. A man gets lonely living alone, and you're a remarkable woman. But that's not what this offer is about. You and your sons would have your own space, your own independence, and no expectations beyond honest work and fair dealing. It was the right answer, delivered with the kind of honesty that Margaret had learned to value above smooth words or false promises. Joseph was admitting to human feelings while making it clear that the practical arrangement didn't depend on those feelings being reciprocated. "How long would you want us to commit to such an arrangement?" she asked. "No specific time limit," Joseph replied. "Long enough to see if it works for everyone. Long enough for the boys to really learn the skills they'd need to make their own way in the world. Long enough to build something worth building." Margaret stood up from the table and walked to the same window where Joseph had stood earlier, looking out over land that could potentially become home to her family. The landscape was different from the green hills of Ireland, but there was something appealing about its vast openness, its promise of space to grow and prosper. Behind her, she could hear her sons whispering among themselves, probably trying to convince each other that this impossible opportunity might actually be real. She thought about the alternatives: more wandering, more uncertainty, more nights of sharing scraps and wondering where the next meal would come from. But she also thought about the risks. They barely knew this man despite his kindness. They were talking about committing their futures to someone they'd met less than 24 hours ago. It went against every practical instinct she'd developed during months of careful survival. On the other hand, Joseph Running Bear had already demonstrated more genuine concern for her family's welfare than anyone else they'd encountered since leaving Ireland. His offer was detailed, thoughtful, and honest in its acknowledgement of mutual benefit. And perhaps most importantly, it offered her sons the chance to become men with real skills and real prospects, instead of drifters dependent on temporary work and charitable impulses. Margaret turned back to face the table, where 4 pairs of eyes waited for her decision. "When would this arrangement begin?" she asked. "Today, if you're willing," Joseph said. "Tomorrow, if you need time to think about it. And if we decided to try it for a while, we could leave if it didn't work out. With my blessing and enough. Money to get you wherever you wanted to go," Joseph confirmed. Margaret looked at each of her sons in turn, seeing the hope they were trying not to show too openly. Then she looked at Joseph Running Bear, this half-Apache, half-Irish rancher who had somehow appeared in their lives at the moment when they needed him most. "Mr. Running Bear," she said formally, "on behalf of myself and my sons, I accept your proposition. We'll stay and work with you to build something worth building." The cheer that went up from her 3 boys was loud enough to startle the horses in the distant corral, and Margaret found herself laughing for the first time since Dennis's death. Joseph's smile was quiet but deeply satisfied, as if he'd just solved a puzzle that had been troubling him for months. "In that case," he said, standing up and extending his hand to Margaret, "welcome home, Mrs. Flanagan. Welcome home." 3 months into their new life at the Running Bear Ranch, the first real test of their partnership came not from within their growing family, but from the outside world that had never quite known what to make of Joseph's mixed heritage and now found his household arrangement even more difficult to categorize. The trouble began on a crisp November morning, when Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, humming an old Irish ballad that her mother had taught her decades ago. She'd grown comfortable in her new role as the ranch's domestic manager, and the sight of clean clothes fluttering in the high desert wind had become a symbol of the stability she'd never thought she'd find again. The boys were scattered across the property, Michael working with Joseph to repair a damaged section of fence, Patrick helping with the morning feeding of the horses, and Sean practicing his reading while perched on a corral rail, book in one hand and apple in the other. It was Sean who first spotted the approaching riders, his young eyes catching the dust cloud on the eastern horizon before anyone else noticed. "Mama!" he called, pointing toward the distant figures. "Company coming!" Margaret shaded her eyes. against the morning sun, and counted 4 riders moving at a deliberate pace toward the ranch. Something about their formation, too organized to be casual visitors, too purposeful to be travelers seeking directions, made her stomach tighten with an instinctive wariness she'd learned to trust during their months of wandering. Joseph appeared. From the direction of the fence line, Michael at his side, both men moving with the quick, alert gait of people who'd recognized potential trouble. "Margaret, take the boys into the house," Joseph called, his voice carrying a note of authority she'd rarely heard from him. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, his 14-year-old pride bristling at being dismissed like a child. "Maybe nothing," Joseph replied, but his hand had moved automatically to check that his rifle was within easy reach. But when the territorial marshal travels with 3 armed men, it's usually not a social call. Margaret felt her blood turn cold. They'd been so careful to keep their arrangement respectable, so conscious of avoiding any appearance of impropriety that might give gossips ammunition against them. She and the boys maintained their own living quarters in the ranch's secondary building. Their meals together were chaperoned by the boys' constant presence, and she'd made sure that anyone who visited could see that this was a working partnership, not some scandalous arrangement. But Margaret had learned during her months in America that respectability was often defined less by reality than by the prejudices of whoever held power in a given situation. And a territorial marshal traveling with armed men suggested that someone with influence had decided their household violated some unwritten rule about how decent people were supposed to live. "Sean, Patrick, inside now," Margaret said firmly, using the tone that brooked no argument. "Michael, you too." "I'm not leaving," Michael declared, with the stubborn determination that reminded Margaret so forcefully of his father. "If there's trouble, I belong here with Joseph." Joseph looked at the approaching riders, now close enough to make out individual faces, and made a quick decision. "Michael can stay, but he keeps quiet unless I ask him to speak. Margaret, I need you to go. Inside, but stay near the window where you can see and hear everything. If this goes badly, you'll need to know what was said." The 4 riders reached the ranch house just as Margaret disappeared through the front door, though she positioned herself immediately at the front window where she could observe the proceedings. The man leading the group was someone she'd never seen before, a tall, lean figure in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested years of outdoor work, but wearing clothes that marked him as someone who'd risen above manual labor. "You Joseph Running Bear?" the man asked without dismounting or offering any of the courtesies that usually preceded conversations between strangers. "I am," Joseph replied evenly. "And you are?" "Marshal Tom Hendricks, Territorial Government. These men are my deputies." He gestured casually toward his companions, 3 younger men who wore their guns with the casual confidence of people accustomed to having their authority backed by force. Joseph nodded politely, but didn't offer the traditional hospitality of inviting them to dismount or share refreshments. Margaret could see the tension in his posture, the way he'd positioned himself to have easy access to both his rifle and the protection offered by the ranch house's thick adobe walls. "What brings you out this way, Marshal?" Joseph asked. Hendricks finally dismounted, but his deputies remained in their saddles, positioned in a loose semicircle that would allow them to control multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated. It was a formation that suggested they'd done this kind of thing before, and Margaret felt her anxiety increase accordingly. "Been getting some complaints about the situation you've got here," Hendricks said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "Questions about whether this household arrangement complies with territorial statutes regarding moral conduct and proper supervision of minor children." The formal language barely concealed what Margaret recognized as a more fundamental challenge. Someone with influence had decided that a half-Apache man, living with an Irish widow and her 3 sons, represented a threat to community standards. Regardless of the actual nature of their relationship, what specific statutes? Joseph asked, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. Territorial Code Section 47 regarding cohabitation outside of marriage. Hendricks read from his document. Section 23 concerning the proper supervision and moral education of children. Section 15 addressing the conduct of individuals holding business licenses in good standing. Michael started to step forward, probably to defend their family's honor, but Joseph's hand on his shoulder kept him in place. Margaret could see the wisdom in restraint, even though every instinct urged her to march outside and confront these men who dared to question their character. "Marshall," Joseph said carefully, "Mrs. Flanagan and her sons are business partners and employees, not cohabitants. They maintain separate living quarters, separate finances, and our relationship is purely professional." "That may be your story," Hendricks replied, "but appearances matter in civilized society. A man and woman living on the same property, sharing meals, working together daily, it creates an impression of impropriety that reflects poorly on territorial standards." The real issue, Margaret realized, wasn't morality at all. It was the challenge that their success represented to people who believed that certain kinds of arrangements between cultures, between classes, between people who didn't fit conventional categories were inherently threatening to established order. "Who filed these complaints?" Joseph asked. Hendricks smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who held all the legal cards. "That information is confidential, but I can tell you that multiple upstanding citizens have expressed concern about the example being set here." Margaret thought immediately of their recent trip to Copper Ridge for supplies, where she'd noticed the way certain shopkeepers had watched their interaction with obvious disapproval. There had been whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, glances that followed them through the streets, and a general atmosphere of judgment that she'd hoped was merely temporary curiosity about newcomers. "What exactly are you here to do?" Joseph asked bluntly. "I'm here to inform you that this arrangement needs to be regularized within 30 days, or the children will be removed to proper custodial care, and you'll face charges under the territorial moral conduct statutes." The word regularized hung in the air like a weapon. Margaret understood immediately what it meant: marriage or separation. The territorial government was giving them a choice between a forced wedding or the destruction of their family. Michael's face had gone pale with understanding, and Margaret could see him struggling with the urge to speak. At 14, he was old enough to understand the implications of what the marshal was proposing, old enough to know that bureaucratic power could tear apart families just as efficiently as poverty or disease. 30 days, Joseph repeated slowly. 30 days, Hendricks confirmed. Either Mrs. Flanagan becomes Mrs. Running Bear through proper Christian marriage, or she and her children are relocated to more appropriate circumstances. And if we choose neither option, then the children become wards of the territorial government, placed in institutions or foster homes where they can receive proper moral guidance. Mrs. Flanagan would be free to make her own arrangements, of course, but she would no longer have legal custody of her sons. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic coldness, but its impact was devastating. Margaret pressed her hand against the window, fighting the urge to rush outside and physically attack the man who dared to threaten her children. After everything they'd survived, after finally finding stability and hope, some distant officials had decided their happiness was inconvenient. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating options and finding them all problematic. Marriage under these circumstances would be a forced arrangement, entered into under legal duress rather than mutual affection. But refusing might mean losing the boys entirely. a possibility that would destroy Margaret and eliminate any chance of the family remaining together. "Marshall," Joseph said finally, "Mrs. Flanagan and I will need time to discuss this situation and make appropriate decisions." "Of course," Hendricks replied with false generosity. 29 days remaining. I'll be back on December 15th to see how you've chosen to resolve the matter." After the marshal and his deputies rode away, the ranch fell into a silence that seemed to echo with the weight of impossible choices. Joseph and Michael stood in the yard for several minutes, neither speaking, both staring at the dust cloud receding toward the eastern horizon. Margaret emerged from the house, her face pale but determined. "They can't really do this, can they? Take my children away because we're working together? They can try," Joseph said grimly, "and in territorial courts they might succeed. The law gives officials a lot of discretion when it comes to moral conduct and child welfare." Patrick and Sean had crept out of the house as well, drawn by the tension they could feel, even without understanding its source. "What's happening?" Patrick asked. "Why were those men so angry?" Margaret knelt down to his level, trying to find words that would explain adult cruelty to children who'd already seen too much of the world's hardness. "Some people think that families should only be made one way," she said carefully. "They don't understand that people can care about each other and help each other without fitting into neat categories." "Are they going to make us leave?" Sean asked, his 7-year-old voice small with worry. "No," Margaret said firmly, though she wasn't sure how she could keep that promise. "We're going to figure out a way to stay together, no matter what." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret was calculating the impossible mathematics of their situation. Marriage to Joseph would solve the legal problem, but it would transform their carefully balanced partnership into something neither of them had chosen freely. Not marrying meant risking the loss of her children, a possibility too horrible to seriously consider. That evening, after the boys had been sent to bed, Margaret and Joseph sat at his kitchen table, nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold, while they wrestled with decisions that seemed to have no good solutions. "I won't have you forced into marriage to save my family," Margaret said firmly. "That's not fair to you, and it's not the kind of example I want to set for my sons." "And I won't stand by and let them take your children away," Joseph replied, with equal determination. "There has to be another option." "What if there isn't?" Margaret asked quietly. "What if we really are looking at a choice between a forced marriage and losing the boys?" Joseph was silent for a long time, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions that seemed to have none. Finally, he looked up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Would marrying me really be so terrible?" he asked quietly. The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond legal necessity. Margaret studied Joseph's face, seeing not just the man who'd saved her family from starvation, but the partner who'd helped her rediscover hope, the friend who'd listened to her fears and shared his own, the person who'd become essential to her sense of what home meant. "No," she admitted softly, "it wouldn't be terrible at all, but marriage should be about choice, not legal coercion." "What if we could find a way to make it about choice?" Joseph asked. "What if we took the 30 days to really consider whether this might be what we want, regardless of what the marshal demands?" It was a possibility that Margaret hadn't allowed herself to consider, too focused on the injustice of forced marriage to think about whether voluntary marriage might actually be something she desired. But now, looking at Joseph across the table, where they'd shared countless meals and conversations, she found herself imagining what it might mean to choose him not just as a partner in business, but as a partner in life. 29 days, she said thoughtfully. 29 days, Joseph agreed, to figure out what we really want, separate from what they're trying to force us to choose. Outside, the New Mexico wind carried the scent of approaching winter, and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Inside, two people who'd found each other by accident began the complicated process of deciding whether they wanted to find each other by choice, knowing that the future of three young boys depended on the wisdom of their decision. The testing had begun, and none of them yet knew whether they would emerge stronger or be broken by the forces arrayed against them. 21 days after the Marshal's ultimatum, the carefully constructed world that Margaret and Joseph had built together began to fracture in ways none of them had anticipated. The crisis came not from the government officials they'd been expecting, but from within their own community, and it arrived in the form of Father Miguel Santos, the traveling priest who ministered to the scattered Catholic families throughout the territorial district. Margaret was in the middle of her weekly bread baking when she heard the approaching wagon, its wheels creating a distinctive rhythm on the hard-packed earth that told her this wasn't Joseph returning from his cattle inspection or one of the boys coming back from their various tasks around the ranch. She wiped flour from her hands and stepped onto the front porch, immediately recognizing the slight, dark-robed figure seated beside the wagon driver. Father Santos had been a fixture in her life since childhood in County Mayo, though not this particular priest, of course. Rather, he represented the kind of uncompromising moral authority that had shaped her understanding of right and wrong, sin and redemption, the narrow path between salvation and damnation. The sight of him climbing down from the wagon with obvious difficulty, he had to be well past 70, brought back a flood of memories from her Irish childhood, when the priest's weekly visit to their village had been both comfort and terror. And for the families who gathered to confess their failures and seek absolution, Mrs. Flanagan, Father Santos called in accented English that revealed his Spanish origins, "I hope I find you in good health." "Father," Margaret replied, automatically smoothing her dress and checking to make sure her hair was properly pinned back. "This is an unexpected honor. Please come inside where it's warm." But the priest didn't immediately move toward the house. Instead, he stood in the yard, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, studying the ranch buildings with the careful attention of someone conducting an inspection. His gaze lingered on the separate quarters where Margaret and the boys lived, the main house where Joseph slept, the workshop where Michael had been learning woodworking and metalcraft, the corrals where Patrick helped tend the horses, and the garden where Sean had discovered an unexpected talent for coaxing vegetables from the high desert soil. "You have built something impressive here," Father Santos said finally. "The work of many hands, guided by purpose and discipline. Joseph has been a good teacher," Margaret replied carefully, uncertain where this conversation was leading, but sensing undercurrents that made her wary. "Ah, yes, Mr. Running Bear. I have heard much about him and about the arrangement you have made together." The priest's tone was neutral, but Margaret caught the slight emphasis on arrangement that suggested he'd already formed opinions about their situation. Michael appeared from the direction of the barn, probably drawn by curiosity about their visitor. At 14, he'd grown 2 inches since arriving at the ranch and filled out considerably, the regular food and hard work transforming him from a skinny refugee into a young man with the beginning of real strength. He approached with the careful politeness that Margaret had drilled into all her sons when dealing with authority figures. "Father," Michael said with a respectful nod, "I'm Michael Flanagan." "The eldest boy," Father Santos observed, studying Michael with the penetrating gaze that priests seemed to perfect during their training. "I have heard that you are learning the ranching trade with considerable skill." "Yes, sir. Joseph, Mr. Running Bear, has been teaching me everything about managing cattle and horses. I can handle most of the daily operations now." The pride in Michael's voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt a familiar surge of maternal satisfaction at seeing her son confident and capable. but she also noticed the way Father Santos's expression tightened slightly at Michael's obvious affection for Joseph, as if the boy's enthusiasm somehow confirmed suspicions the priest had already formed. "And where are your other sons?" Father Santos asked. "Patrick is helping with the afternoon feeding," Margaret replied. "Sean is at his lessons with Mrs. Chen, the teacher who comes out from Copper Ridge twice a week." "Ah, yes, the Chinese woman. Another unusual arrangement in this area." The way Father Santos said "unusual" made it clear that he viewed the entire district with suspicion, as if the high desert somehow encouraged departures from proper Catholic orthodoxy. Margaret had heard rumors about the priest's conservatism, his resistance to what he saw as the dangerous moral flexibility that frontier life seemed to encourage among his scattered parishioners. Joseph chose that moment to return from his inspection of the northern pastures, riding up to the house with the easy competence that had become second nature to him. He dismounted and approached the group with polite wariness, clearly recognizing Father Santos despite never having met him personally. "Father," Joseph said with a respectful nod, "I'm Joseph Running Bear. Welcome to our ranch, Mr. Running Bear." The priest's acknowledgement was correct but cool, and Margaret immediately sensed the tension that seemed to radiate from him in Joseph's presence. "I have come to discuss certain concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding this household." Joseph's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw his hands tighten slightly on his horse's reins. "What kind of concerns, Father?" "The kind that affect the moral welfare of 3 Catholic children who appear to be living in circumstances that conflict with church teaching about proper family structure and moral conduct." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Margaret felt her carefully controlled composure begin to crack as she realized that the priest's visit wasn't pastoral concern, but moral prosecution. "Father Santos," she said, stepping forward with the kind of controlled anger that had sustained her through months of desperate traveling, "my sons are living in a Christian household where they are fed, educated, protected, and taught the value of honest work. I fail to see how that conflicts with church teaching." "Mrs. Flanagan," the priest replied with the patient tone that religious authorities used when correcting the spiritually confused, "the issue is not the quality of care your children receive, but the scandal created by an unmarried woman cohabiting with a man who is not her husband, particularly a man whose spiritual condition is uncertain." The phrase "spiritual condition" was delivered with particular emphasis, and Margaret understood immediately that Father Santos's concerns went beyond simple questions of propriety. This was about Joseph's mixed heritage, about the Apache blood. That made him suspect in the eyes of those who viewed Christianity and indigenous traditions as fundamentally incompatible. Michael's face had gone red with anger, and Margaret could see him struggling with the desire to defend both Joseph and their family's honor. "Father," he said carefully, "Mr. Running Bear has shown us nothing but kindness and respect. He's taught us valuable skills and treated us like family when we had nowhere else to go." "I do not question Mr. Running Bear's intentions," Father Santos replied, "but intentions, however well-meaning, cannot overcome the appearance of impropriety or the spiritual dangers inherent in certain associations." Joseph had been listening to this exchange with growing tension, and now he stepped forward with the kind of quiet dignity that Margaret had learned to associate with moments when he was most angry. "Father, with respect, what specific spiritual dangers are you referring to?" "The dangers that arise when Christian children are exposed to pagan influences, when they are raised in an environment that normalizes arrangements contrary to church teaching about marriage and family." The word pagan struck like a physical blow, and Margaret saw Joseph's carefully controlled expression harden into something approaching hostility. She knew enough about his background to understand that his Apache mother had been a devout Catholic, who'd successfully integrated her traditional spiritual practices with Christian faith, and that Joseph himself had been raised in both traditions without seeing them as contradictory. "My mother was baptized in the Catholic Church," Joseph said quietly. "She raised me to honor both my Apache heritage and my Christian faith. I've never seen them as conflicting loyalties." "That may be your perception," Father Santos replied, "but the Church cannot approve of spiritual syncretism or moral arrangements that set inappropriate examples for impressionable young minds." Margaret felt something snap inside her chest, a fury that had been building since the priest's first carefully veiled accusations. "Father Santos," she said with ice in her voice, "are you suggesting that my sons would be better off in some territorial institution than in a home where they're loved and cared for?" "I'm suggesting," the priest replied with infuriating calm, "that there are ways to regularize this situation that would address both the Church's concerns and the children's welfare." "Marriage," Michael said bluntly, having obviously understood the subtext of the conversation. "Marriage performed in the Church with proper spiritual preparation and commitment to raising any future children in strict accordance with Catholic teaching," Father Santos confirmed. Joseph looked at Margaret, and she saw in his expression the same frustrated anger she was feeling. They were being cornered by forces beyond their control, pushed toward a decision that should have been theirs alone, to make in their own time and their own way. "And if we choose not to marry," Margaret asked, "then I would be compelled to add my voice to those calling for the territorial authorities to intervene on behalf of the children's spiritual welfare." The threat was delivered with priestly authority, but Margaret heard it as clearly as if Father Santos had drawn a gun. The Church would support the government's efforts to break up their family unless they submitted to marriage under ecclesiastical supervision. Patrick and Sean chose that moment to return from their respective activities, both boys immediately, sensing the tension that had settled over the group like a storm cloud. Patrick, at 11, was old enough to understand that adult conversations conducted in those particular tones usually meant trouble for children. "Mama?" Sean asked uncertainly, moving to stand close beside her. "These are my other sons." "Margaret," said to Father Santos, her voice carefully controlled. "Patrick and Sean." The priest studied both boys with the same penetrating gaze he'd directed at Michael, and Margaret felt protective fury rise in her chest as she recognized the clinical assessment in his expression. To Father Santos, her sons weren't individuals, with their own personalities and dreams, but Catholic souls whose spiritual welfare was being endangered by their family's unconventional circumstances. "Fine boys," Father Santos said finally. "They deserve the stability and moral guidance that can only come from a properly consecrated Christian household." Joseph had been growing increasingly tense throughout this exchange, and now he spoke with carefully controlled anger. "Father, these boys have stability and moral guidance. They're learning skills that will serve them throughout their lives. They're receiving education. They're part of a family that cares about their welfare. But not a family that has been blessed by the Church or recognized by civil authority," Father Santos replied. "And therein lies the problem." Margaret looked at her three sons, seeing confusion and fear growing in their faces as they began to understand that their carefully rebuilt world was once again under threat. Sean moved closer to her side, instinctively seeking the comfort of physical contact. Patrick's expression had grown guarded, the look of a child who'd learned not to trust adult promises of security. Michael's face showed the kind of helpless anger that came from understanding problems he was powerless to solve. "How long do we have to make this decision?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected she knew the answer. "The territorial marshal has given you until December 15th, Father Santos replied. "I understand that leaves 8 more days. The Church would, of course, prefer to see this matter resolved through proper spiritual channels rather than government intervention." 8 days. Margaret felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders like stones. Marriage to a man she'd grown to care for deeply, but under circumstances that would forever taint the union with coercion rather than free choice. Or the loss of her children to institutional care that would separate them from each other and from the life they'd built together. "We'll give your words serious consideration, Father," Joseph said, with formal politeness that barely concealed his anger. "I pray that you will," Father Santos replied. "And I pray that you'll choose the path that serves not just your immediate desires, but the eternal welfare of 3 innocent souls whose spiritual future hangs in the balance." After the priest left, the ranch fell into a silence that seemed to echo with the weight of ultimatums and impossible choices. Margaret gathered her sons around the kitchen table, trying to find words that would explain adult complications to children who'd already endured too much uncertainty. "Are we going to have to leave again?" Sean asked, his 7-year-old voice small with worry. "No," Margaret said firmly, though she wasn't sure how she could keep that promise. "We're going to find a way to stay together, no matter what." "But, how?" Patrick asked with 11-year-old practicality. "If the priest and the marshal both say we have to change everything, how can we stay the same?" It was Michael who provided the answer that none of the adults had wanted to voice. "Mama and Joseph will have to get married," he said simply. "It's the only way to keep our family together." Margaret looked across the table at Joseph, seeing in his expression the same mixture of frustration and resignation she was feeling. They were being forced into a corner by people who claimed to have their best interests at heart, pushed toward a decision that should have been made from love rather than legal necessity. "Is that what you want?" Joseph asked quietly, directing the question to Margaret but including the boys with his gaze. Margaret thought about the months they'd spent building something precious together. Trust, partnership, the particular kind of affection that grew from shared work and mutual respect. She thought about the way Joseph had become essential to her sense of what home meant, how his steady presence had helped her rediscover hope after Dennis's death. "I want us to stay together," she said finally, "whatever that requires." "Then we'll get married," Joseph said simply, "not because they're forcing us to, but because it's what we choose to preserve our family." Outside, the December wind carried the scent of coming snow and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Inside, 2 people who'd found each other by accident prepared to choose each other by design, knowing that love forced by circumstance might still grow into something real and lasting if they were wise enough and patient enough to let it flourish. In its own time, the crucible had tested them and they'd chosen to emerge, not broken, but transformed into something stronger than either could have been alone. December 14th, 1923, dawned clear and cold across the New Mexico high desert, the kind of crystalline winter morning that made the distant mountains look close enough to touch and turned every breath into visible proof of life persisting in harsh beauty. But inside the Running Bear Ranch house, the approaching deadline had created an atmosphere that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with the weight of choices that would echo through generations. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson, while she prepared for what might be either the most important day of her life or the most tragic mistake she'd ever made. Tomorrow, Marshal Hendricks would return, expecting to find either a legally married couple or a family ready for separation. Today was their last opportunity to prove that love chosen under pressure could still be genuine, that a wedding forced by circumstance might still become the foundation for something beautiful and lasting. The wedding dress, hanging on the door of her wardrobe, had been her mother's, carefully preserved through years of poverty and carried across an ocean in the single trunk that represented everything the Flanagan family had managed to salvage from their old life. Made of cream-colored silk that had yellowed slightly with age, it represented not just her mother's hopes for her daughter's future, but the continuity of dreams across generations of women who'd understood that sometimes survival required transformation. Margaret had altered the dress to fit her own smaller frame during the long nights of the past week, when sleep had proved elusive and the steady rhythm of needlework had provided the only peace she could find amid the chaos of forced decisions. Each careful stitch had been both meditation and prayer, a way of honoring her mother's memory while preparing for a future that would have been unimaginable to the young Irish girl who'd first worn this dress 30 years earlier. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation, followed by Sean's voice asking permission to enter. Her youngest son stepped into the room, carrying a small bouquet of winter flowers that he'd somehow managed to gather despite the season's limitations. Desert marigolds, late-blooming chamisa, and branches of pinon pine tied together with ribbon that Patrick had contributed from his small collection of treasures. "I made this for you, Mama," Sean said, with the serious formality that 7-year-old boys reserved for truly important occasions. Patrick said brides need flowers, and Michael said we should make it ourselves instead of buying something from town. Margaret knelt to accept the bouquet, feeling tears threaten as she recognized the love and care her sons had put into this simple gift. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. The most beautiful bouquet I've ever seen." "Are you scared?" Sean asked with the direct honesty that children used to cut through adult complications. Margaret considered the question seriously, recognizing that her youngest son deserved an honest answer rather than false reassurance. "A little," she admitted. "Getting married is a big step, even when you care about someone very much. But you do care about Joseph, don't you? Really care about him, not just because the marshal says you have to." The question revealed how much Sean had understood about their situation, despite adult efforts to shield him from its complexities. Margaret pulled her son close, breathing in the scent of his hair and the outdoors that always seemed to cling to him now that he'd discovered the freedom of ranch life. "Yes, sweetheart, I really care about him, and more importantly, he really cares about all of us," Sean nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this confirmation. "Good. Because Patrick and Michael and me, we talked about it, and we decided we want him to be our new papa, not instead of our real papa, but as well as." The innocent wisdom of children had somehow found the perfect way to honor Dennis's memory while embracing the possibility of new love. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride at her son's capacity for emotional generosity, their ability to understand that love wasn't a finite resource that diminished when shared. Patrick and Michael appeared in the doorway, both dressed in their best clothes and wearing expressions of nervous excitement. At 11 and 14, they were old enough to understand the significance of this day while still young enough to believe that adult decisions could somehow magically solve all problems. "Mama," Patrick said formally, "we wanted to ask if you'd like us to walk with you to the church." The question touched her deeply, recognizing her son's desire to participate in this transformation of their family structure. "I can't think of anything I'd like more," she replied. "After all, this wedding isn't just about Joseph and me, it's about all of us becoming a family in a new way." Michael stepped forward with the kind of serious determination that had become his trademark since taking on the role of family protector. "We also wanted to tell you that whatever happens, we're proud of you. You kept us together when everything was falling apart, and now you're keeping us together by making this choice." The maturity in her eldest son's voice reminded Margaret of how much her children had grown during their months at the ranch, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They'd learned to trust again, to hope again, to believe that good things could happen to people who'd experienced devastating loss. "We should get ready to leave," Margaret said, glancing at the clock on her dresser. "Mrs. Chen said she'd meet us at the church to serve as witness, and Joseph's friend Thomas from the Apache reservation is riding in to stand up with him." The wedding was being held at the small Catholic church in Copper Ridge, a compromise that satisfied Father Santos's insistence on proper religious ceremony while avoiding the elaborate preparations that would have attracted more attention than Margaret wanted. She'd specifically requested a simple, private ceremony with only essential witnesses present, partly because of the circumstances that had forced their decision, and partly because she wanted to focus on the spiritual significance of their commitment, rather than social expectations. As the family prepared to leave for town, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 11 months ago, she'd been scraping mold off rotten apples while her children slowly starved, believing that their lives had been reduced to simple survival without hope of genuine happiness. Now, she was preparing to marry a man who'd not only saved their lives, but had somehow helped them rediscover the possibility of joy. The ride to Copper Ridge passed in comfortable conversation, the boys' excitement gradually infecting Margaret with something approaching anticipation rather than mere resignation. Joseph had left earlier to make final arrangements with Father Santos and to meet with his friend Thomas, giving Margaret time to prepare herself emotionally for the transformation that was about to occur. The church, when they arrived, proved to be a simple adobe structure that somehow managed to feel both humble and sacred, its plain wooden pews and hand-carved altar suggesting generations of faith practiced without ostentation. Father Santos waited at the front of the nave, his expression suggesting grudging acceptance rather than enthusiasm, while Mrs. Chen sat in the front pew with the quiet dignity that characterized everything about the Chinese teacher who'd become an unexpected friend. Joseph stood near the altar with a tall, weathered Apache man who wore traditional clothing adapted for the formality of the occasion, a combination of buckskin and cotton that honored both cultures while compromising neither. Margaret recognized this as Thomas Singing Wolf, Joseph's childhood friend, who'd ridden 40 miles to serve as witness to a ceremony that bridged multiple worlds. But what struck Margaret most was Joseph's expression as she walked down the aisle, with her 3 sons flanking her like an honor guard. His face showed none of the resignation or duty that might have been expected from a man being forced into marriage by external pressure. Instead, he looked like someone who'd finally found something he'd been searching for without realizing he was looking. Someone who understood that love arrived in unexpected packages and that wisdom lay in recognizing its value regardless of the circumstances that delivered it. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, Father Santos reading the traditional words with professional competence while Joseph and Margaret spoke their vows with quiet sincerity. When Joseph placed the simple gold band on Margaret's finger, his mother's wedding ring, carefully sized to fit her hand, she felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this moment represented not just legal necessity, but genuine choice. "You may kiss the bride," Father Santos announced with the air of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Joseph's kiss was gentle and respectful, a promise of patience rather than passion, acknowledgement that their marriage would need time to grow into something deeper than mutual affection and shared circumstances. But there was warmth in it too, and genuine care, and Margaret found herself thinking that marriages had been built on far less solid foundations. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, held in the church's small social hall with food, prepared by Mrs. Chen and the few other families who'd chosen to attend despite the controversial nature of the union. Sean danced with infectious enthusiasm, while Patrick and Michael took turns testing their new stepfather's patience with increasingly elaborate questions about ranch operations. Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Finally, able to enjoy the company of people who'd chosen to support their family rather than judge it. But the real test came that evening when they returned to the ranch as a legally married couple, facing the challenge of transforming a partnership into something deeper and more permanent. They discussed the practical arrangements during the week leading up to the wedding. Margaret would move her belongings into the main house, while the boys remained in their familiar quarters, ensuring privacy for the newlyweds while maintaining stability for the children. "Are you having second thoughts?" Joseph asked as they stood on the front porch, watching the boys tend to their evening chores with the easy competence they'd developed over months of ranch life. Margaret considered the question honestly, trying to separate her genuine feelings from the anxiety that naturally accompanied such a significant life change. "No second thoughts about marrying you," she said finally. "Some nervousness about learning to be married again, but no regrets about the choice we made." "It's going to take time," Joseph acknowledged, "building a real marriage instead of just a legal arrangement. But we have time now, and we have each other, and we have 3 boys who need us to succeed." "Do you think we will? Succeed, I mean." Joseph was quiet for a moment, studying the landscape that had become home to all of them. "I think we've already succeeded in the most important ways," he said finally. "We've created a family, we've built something worth protecting, and we've proven that people from different worlds can find common ground. The rest is just details." The following morning brought Marshal Hendricks precisely on schedule, his expression suggesting someone prepared to deal with either compliance or defiance with equal professional competence. But when he was presented with a legal marriage certificate signed by Father Santos and witnessed by respectable members of the community, his official interest in their arrangement evaporated immediately. "Well," he said with grudging approval, "looks like you've resolved the matter in an appropriate fashion. Territorial government appreciates citizens who choose to comply with moral standards." After the marshal left, the ranch settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and subtly different. The work continued as before: cattle to tend, horses to train, crops to harvest, equipment to maintain. But now it carried the weight of shared commitment rather than temporary arrangement. Margaret found herself thinking in terms of years and decades rather than seasons, planning improvements and investments that reflected permanence rather than survival. The boys adapted to their new family structure with the resilience that children display when their essential needs for security and affection are met. Sean began calling Joseph Papa Joe without prompting, while Patrick and Michael gradually shifted from formal respect to genuine affection. Most importantly, they began planning for futures that extended beyond simple escape from poverty. Michael talked seriously about starting his own ranch someday. Patrick developed plans for advanced education that might lead to veterinary practice. And Sean demonstrated an intuitive understanding of horses that suggested genuine talent. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred between Margaret and Joseph themselves, as they discovered that love chosen under pressure could indeed grow into something deeper and more meaningful than either had imagined possible. Their marriage began as a practical arrangement forced by circumstances, but it evolved into genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the particular intimacy that came from building something important together. 5 years later, as Margaret stood in the same spot where she'd first watched her sons share scraps by Joseph's fence, she marveled at the transformation that had occurred in all their lives. The ranch had grown to encompass twice as much land and 3 times as many cattle. Michael, now 19, managed most of the daily operations while preparing to purchase adjacent property with Joseph's backing. Patrick had enrolled in the Territorial Agricultural College, pursuing studies that would eventually lead to innovative approaches to high-desert farming. Sean, at 12, had developed a reputation throughout the district for his ability to train horses that others considered hopeless. And Margaret herself had discovered that love could indeed arrive unexpectedly, that families could be built from the most unlikely materials, and that sometimes the choices forced upon us by circumstances turned out to be the choices we would have made anyway, if we'd been wise enough to recognize what we truly needed. The woman who'd once scraped mold off rotten apples had become the matriarch of a thriving ranch family, proof that transformation was possible for anyone willing to accept help when it was offered, and to offer help when it was needed. The Half-Apache man who'd opened his door to strangers had found the family he'd been missing without realizing he was looking for it, and together they'd built something that honored both their individual histories and their shared future. On winter evenings, when the high desert wind carried the scent of snow and distant possibilities, Margaret and Joseph would sit on their front porch and remember that day when 4 strangers had become family, when desperation had been transformed into hope, and when a simple act of kindness had rippled outward to create changes that none of them could have imagined. The story that had begun with hunger and ended with abundance, that had started with separation and concluded with unity, that had commenced with strangers and culminated with family, served as proof that sometimes the most important transformations occurred not despite difficult circumstances, but because of them, and that the courage to say stay when others might say go could change not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of what was possible in a world where kindness was always needed and never wasted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.